Rebecca Shelton hadn't stepped foot on the lakefront property in nearly 18 months. Not since she'd signed the final set of permits for the bridge project that she had designed and executed herself. The house at the edge of Blackridge Lake wasn't meant to be permanent. It was built to be a retreat, a place where solitude and stillness wouldn't feel like punishment, but rather a controlled silence she had earned after 20 years in infrastructure consulting. The place had once belonged to her sister, who'd left it to her without much sentimentality, saying only, "You'll know what to do with it." And Rebecca did. She had poured her experience, her stubborn precision, and a good portion of her savings into rebuilding the house's foundations and designing a sleek, modern bridge that connected the rocky perimeter road to the property's secluded outcrop. It wasn't just structurally sound, it was symbolic. The bridge was how she reasserted control over her own life after years of watching things fall apart, both personally and professionally. But when she arrived on that cool morning in late October, just as the mist was lifting off the lake, and the trees were shedding their last leaves in tired bursts of rust and gold, Rebecca saw something that made her instinctively slow the car down. Before she even reached the clearing, her chest tightened before she could make sense of what her eyes were trying to tell her. The bridge she had designed, tested, calibrated, and proudly certified herself, was gone. Not collapsed, not decayed, not washed away by some freak storm or damaged by tree fall. Gone. Cleanly, surgically, as if someone had unfastened it piece by piece and carried it off into the woods without leaving a single screw behind. The only thing that remained was the concrete base on either side of the channel and a long gouge in the gravel where her tires once rolled across, now leading to a sudden drop into still water. She stepped out of the car without turning off the engine, numb to the early morning chill that cut across the clearing. Her boots crunched on damp gravel as she moved toward the edge of what used to be the bridge, her breath fogging in the air. Rebecca didn't say a word. She didn't gasp or cry out or call anyone. She simply stared, her mind ticking through structural terminology and field protocols like gears clicking into place. Removal, not failure. Intentional action. Precision cuts through steel anchors. No splintering, no burn marks, no corrosion. Someone knew what they were doing. Someone removed her bridge deliberately. The presence of a signpost caught her attention only after a full minute. Just off to the left of the old anchor point, there was a thin, newly embedded metal stake with a laminated placard zip tied to it. An amateur move. The sign read, "Restricted passage, unsafe structure removed, access temporarily suspended." No insignia, no agency reference, no signature. Just vague language and a generic threat dressed up as civic duty. Rebecca's eyes narrowed as she scanned the surrounding area. No construction tape, no equipment marks, but she did notice faint impressions in the gravel near the water. Thin treads, narrow but fresh, indicating machinery had been used, likely a lightweight mobile crane or a pivoting arm, nothing large enough to trigger noise complaints or visible damage to the roadside. Efficient, stealthy, not improvised. She took a long breath and stepped back from the edge, her hand instinctively reaching for the phone in her coat pocket before she remembered that she had no service this far out. The house didn't even have fiber yet. She'd never gotten around to installing full security, only a few interior sensors for rodents and temperature alerts. That had always felt like enough, until now. Something had changed. Someone had made a move, and not in a careless or desperate way. This was measured, prepared, and personal. By the time Rebecca made her way around the lake on foot, through the marshy paths and overgrown brush that only made sense to someone who knew the old trails, she'd had 2 hours to process the absence of the bridge and catalog every step of sabotage it must have taken. The house looked untouched, at least on the surface. The shutters were closed, the deck was intact. The power meter still blinked steadily, but when she tried her key, the lock turned with a softness that didn't feel right. Inside, everything was where she'd left it, except the basement hatch, which now bore a different locking mechanism. It wasn't hers. Someone had changed it, discreetly but unmistakably. That was the moment she felt it in her spine. This wasn't just about the bridge. Someone wanted her off this land. They didn't want her dead. They didn't want her frightened. They wanted her gone, cleanly, quietly, with no evidence of coercion. The lake had always attracted land grabbers, developers, and quiet money. Over the last decade, the area had transformed from forgotten woods to prime waterfront real estate. Rebecca had known that when she began restoring the property, but she had relied on the law, her permits, and her own technical competence to keep vultures at bay. She hadn't anticipated a silent dismantling. This wasn't a cease and desist. This was strategy. She spent the rest of the day inspecting the house, taking inventory of tools and materials she had left stored beneath the stairs and in the garage. Some things were missing, small, precise, seemingly random. Her surveyor's level, a box of site markers, backup batteries for her laser grid. Nothing that screamed theft, but enough to suggest intent. Whoever had been here knew what mattered. Not valuables, not equipment, but the tools that made her effective. They hadn't robbed her. They'd neutered her. The first evening back in the house felt surreal. The fireplace still worked. The refrigerator hummed softly. The windows rattled faintly in the wind. But Rebecca felt like she was being watched. Not from the woods or from some camera feed, but in the sense that everything she touched had been touched before her. She opened drawers cautiously. She checked the back of picture frames. She wiped down doorknobs without knowing why. She wasn't looking for evidence. She was reclaiming control. She slept badly, waking every hour to check for sounds that weren't there. The silence was now oppressive, not peaceful. In the morning, she brewed coffee and stood on the porch, watching the water, where her bridge had once arched gracefully. It had taken her 4 months to design and build that structure. It had passed every inspection. It had withstood 2 spring floods, and someone had erased it in a night. She could rebuild it. That wasn't the issue. But now, rebuilding meant declaring war. And before she poured concrete or drove the first anchor, she needed to know exactly who she was up against, not a vandal, not a teenage prank. This was surgical, professional. Someone had decided she was a problem, and whoever they were, they clearly didn't know what kind of problem she could become. Rebecca stood at the kitchen window, clutching the warm ceramic mug in both hands, eyes fixed on the water like it might start whispering names. The second day after her return was colder than the first. A dry, biting chill that seemed to settle in her joints. Overnight, frost had crept across the deck and the car's windshield. She had spent most of the morning pacing through the house, making lists, not just of repairs or replacements, but of questions she couldn't shake. Who knew she was coming back? Who had access to the project files? Who would benefit from cutting her off from the road? She wasn't ready to start rebuilding. Not yet. But she wasn't going to stay paralyzed either. So she made her first move. She walked the perimeter. Not the house, the property. With a notepad in her coat pocket and a pencil tucked behind her ear, she traced the legal boundaries as she remembered them. The property line ran in a semicircle through the woods and hugged a narrow slope of wetland before tapering off to the east, where it met the public trailhead used mostly by locals for fishing and weekend hikes. As she pushed deeper into the overgrowth, she began noticing strange inconsistencies. Survey markers had been pulled, not kicked or weathered away, but pulled cleanly, their metal pins yanked from the ground with enough force to leave shallow craters. Some were simply gone. Others were bent and thrown into the brush. Then there were the tire ruts, not on her property, but along the trail just beyond it. They weren't from a truck or a standard ATV. These were narrow, almost surgical, likely from a mini excavator or low-ground pressure crawler. The soil hadn't compacted from weight. It had been carved with purpose. Rebecca followed the trail to a small clearing just beyond the public easement, a spot she remembered being vacant scrubland. Nothing but ferns and dead saplings. But now it was leveled, cleared of underbrush. The ground raked flat and divided into invisible squares. In the center stood a stack of crates wrapped in industrial plastic, unmarked except for a shipping label half torn by weather. It looked temporary. It looked illegal. No signage, no fence, no flagging tape. Just a raw patch of dirt that screamed, unauthorized staging area. And in the corner of that clearing sat a small prefab utility box, the kind often used for electrical setups before a project is officially greenlit. When Rebecca moved closer, she saw a laminated document, zip-tied to a stake driven through the gravel. Her stomach tightened as she read it. It wasn't a permit. It was a site access authorization, issued by a third-party logistics company based 2 counties south. It didn't list her name. It didn't even mention the lake. But it referenced coordinates that landed squarely on the edge of her land. By the time she returned home, the sun had begun its slow descent. casting long shadows through the trees and splintering the light across the deck like spiderwebs. She stood over the blueprints for the bridge she had stored in a weatherproof tube, now spread across the kitchen island. With them were her property documents, certified, notarized, recorded, including the old easement maps and her final engineering inspection report. She knew what had happened now, or at least part of it. Someone was prepping the land adjacent to hers for development, and in the process, they needed the access her bridge had once provided. Removing it wasn't just an act of sabotage, it was logistical efficiency. But it also wasn't legal, not unless someone had falsified ownership or manipulated access rights. She wouldn't know for sure until she saw the latest records, and that meant going into town. The clerk's office in Mason County was 20 miles west, a quiet, sun-faded building tucked between a defunct gas station and a post office that still hand-stamped most mail. Rebecca arrived just after 11, dressed plainly and speaking politely. She asked for parcel records, topographic changes, and any filed developments or easement requests related to the southeast quadrant of Black Ridge Lake. The woman at the counter looked up from her sandwich and said there'd been nothing new filed in the past 6 months. Rebecca asked again, this time more precisely using boundary terms and the archived parcel ID of her land and the adjacent lots. That's when the woman's brow furrowed. She stood, walked into the back, and returned with a second folder, one that hadn't been scanned yet. Inside were 2 printed forms, a request for provisional land access for equipment transit, and a preliminary development interest statement signed by someone named A. Mallory, representing Westridge Coastal Holdings. Rebecca didn't recognize the name, but she did recognize the parcel numbers. They were hers, or rather they had been, until the records showed that the lakeside margin, roughly 10 feet wide along the eastern edge, had been flagged as Public Utility Coordination Zone. Not sold, not transferred, just reclassified, quietly, without her consent. She returned home with copies, the clerk none the wiser. That evening, as the wind picked up and branches scraped softly against the siding, Rebecca sat in front of the fireplace, the stack of documents in her lap. She didn't call the police. She didn't call a friend. She called a land use attorney in Port Hale she had worked with 5 years earlier on a drainage compliance issue. He was blunt, efficient, and annoyingly methodical, which made him perfect. His name was Matthew Delaney, and when she explained what had happened, he didn't ask if she was sure. He asked for copies. Within the hour, she had scanned and emailed everything. His reply was simple. They've done this before. Don't talk to anyone else. Sit tight. I'll make calls in the morning. For the first time in days, Rebecca allowed herself to exhale. Not because she felt safe, but because she wasn't alone anymore. She was smart enough to know when to stop trying to do it all herself. What she had now wasn't just a property dispute. It was the opening move in a carefully concealed strategy to repurpose land under the guise of bureaucratic neutrality. Her bridge had never been the problem. It was her resistance to being erased quietly that had made her a target. At 3 a.m, she woke to a sound she couldn't immediately place. Not metal or glass, but something heavier, softer, like compressed gravel under too much weight. She didn't move to the window. She didn't call out. She lay still, breathing through her nose, and waited. The sound came again, not closer, not farther, but there. Present. Like the subtle warning of someone stepping where they didn't belong. When she finally rose and peered through the curtain, the clearing was empty. But she knew. Something was coming. The first strike had already landed. Now it was her turn, and this time, she wouldn't let it go unanswered. Rebecca didn't waste any time. She had known that the situation would escalate, but even she hadn't fully anticipated the speed with which it would happen. By the time the sun rose over the misty expanse of Black Ridge Lake the next morning, Rebecca had already made her decision. There was no room for hesitation. As much as she had hoped for a quiet resolution, the events of the past few days had made one thing painfully clear. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding or a petty act of vandalism. The destruction of her bridge and the tampering with her land were part of something much larger, something far more calculated. And the only way to fight back was with the same level of precision and methodical thinking that had made her a respected engineer in her field. She would need to gather her resources and prepare herself for a battle that would take more than just her own resolve. It would require strategy, patience, and a steady hand. After Matthew Delaney, the attorney, had reviewed the documents she sent over, he had called her within hours. His voice had been a mix of concern and professionalism. "You've got a situation here that's bigger than you expected," he had said bluntly. Westridge Coastal Holdings is a real estate investment company. They're not interested in negotiating with homeowners like you. They're interested in consolidating land for development. The key thing here is to make sure we get ahead of them, legally speaking. You've already seen how they operate, quietly, swiftly, with enough legal backing to make your head spin. But we're not going to just sit back and let them bulldoze over you. Rebecca, though used to making tough decisions in her career, had felt the weight of those words settle in her chest. This wasn't just about a bridge anymore. This was about the land itself. She had to act. So she did. She followed through with every detail Matthew suggested, bringing in the best possible resources, both legal and technical. She knew it wouldn't be enough just to have her side of the story. She would need evidence. She would need to make sure that her actions were not only legal but undeniable. Her first step was to recheck the property lines and boundaries, this time bringing in a professional surveyor who could provide an independent, updated record. The surveyor she called Charles Hanks was a local expert with years of experience in boundary disputes, and he was meticulous in his work. The first thing Charles did was drive out with his assistant to remeasure the land from scratch. They spent the day walking the edges of Rebecca's property, taking detailed readings and making notes on every potential point of dispute. As they worked, Rebecca watched the landscape shift under their attention. It wasn't just about land measurements. She could see the surveyors marking every corner, tracing lines through the forest with the precision of someone who understood the legal weight those lines would carry. It was a sobering realization. The land wasn't just physical to Rebecca anymore, it was becoming a battleground, a place where numbers and legal documents could decide her future. By the end of the day, they had gathered enough data to challenge Westridge Coastal Holdings' false claims of jurisdiction over her land. The next day, as planned, Matthew Delaney arranged a meeting with the local authorities. He'd insisted that they meet with Rebecca, saying it was vital to make the first move before Westridge Coastal had a chance to push forward with their plans. The meeting was held in a small conference room at the local courthouse, where a handful of regional zoning commissioners and a representative from the local planning department were seated, waiting for Rebecca and her legal team to present their case. The room was sterile and quiet, with the faint hum of fluorescent lights hanging overhead. Matthew had warned Rebecca that the people in this room weren't on her side. They were bureaucrats who had likely worked with developers before and would likely show some degree of bias. Still, it was necessary to start the legal proceedings with them. As soon as she entered the room, Rebecca's calm and measured presence contrasted with the tense atmosphere. She didn't speak much at first, instead listening carefully to the small talk, watching the eyes of the people in the room flick over her. When the meeting finally began, the county planning official, a man named William Fraser, cleared his throat and started the proceedings. He briefly outlined the issue at hand, Rebecca's land and her bridge, of course. But his focus quickly shifted to the land access request that Westridge Coastal had filed months ago. The development company, it seemed, had been waiting for the right moment to push forward with their plans. They had positioned themselves strategically, buying up land piece by piece, and now they wanted the right-of-way through Rebecca's property. It wasn't just the bridge they wanted, it was the entire swath of land running along the lake's edge. Fraser spoke with practiced ease, emphasizing the public benefit of the proposed project, though Rebecca could sense the underlying impatience in his tone. The words sounded rehearsed, as if they had been used on other property owners who had stood in the way of Westridge Coastal's ambitions. Matthew Delaney had been correct. They were trying to force a conclusion before Rebecca could make her case, but Rebecca wasn't intimidated. She had prepared for this moment for days, and she wasn't going to let them steamroll over her. When it was her turn to speak, she stood slowly, her spine straight, her voice even but firm. She didn't just argue her legal rights to the land. She explained the technical aspects of the bridge she had built, how it had been constructed with both precision and durability, how it was an essential piece of infrastructure that hadn't just served her, but also the surrounding community. She pointed out how, for years, the bridge had been a vital part of the local environment. It wasn't just some DIY project. It was an integral feature that had been developed with a clear understanding of the land's topography, the weather patterns, and even the local wildlife. She provided a copy of the professional survey that had just been completed, showing clearly that the land wasn't in any way under dispute and that Westridge Coastal's request for land access was based on fabricated claims of public utility interest. As she spoke, Rebecca watched the commissioners closely. Some of them looked skeptical. Others seemed irritated by the interruption of their smooth proceedings. But one man sitting near the back didn't look at her at all. His eyes were focused on the stack of documents in front of him, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. He didn't speak, but his posture made it clear that he wasn't fully convinced by the development company's narrative. Rebecca noted the subtle signs of dissent. The meeting dragged on for another hour with her side and Westridge's representative, a lawyer named Alan Jacobs, exchanging words in careful legalese. Jacobs was smooth but not as convincing as Rebecca had expected. His arguments, though logically sound, lacked the depth and conviction she had brought to her own case. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't familiar with the land. He wasn't even familiar with the local community beyond what he had read in briefings. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that he was relying on assumptions. Assumptions Rebecca could easily dismantle. And she did, one by one, presenting facts, presenting data, and presenting her undeniable technical expertise. By the time the meeting adjourned, Rebecca could sense a shift in the room. She hadn't won. Not yet. But the ground had shifted. She had exposed the weaknesses in Westridge Coastal's approach, and it was clear they weren't going to get the immediate approval they had been hoping for. But as the meeting ended and people started to leave, Rebecca felt the chill of uncertainty creeping back in. Westridge had the money, the backing, and the lawyers. But Rebecca had something they didn't. She had the truth, and she had the land. The fight was just beginning, and now it was no longer just a matter of proving that she belonged here. It was about proving that the land, her land, was worth more than their ambition. That evening, Rebecca sat alone at the kitchen table, staring out over the water. She knew there would be more fights ahead. The legal battle had only just begun, and she couldn't afford to let her guard down. But for the first time since her bridge had been destroyed, she felt a sense of clarity. She wasn't just fighting for the land anymore. She was fighting for her own place in the world, for the right to exist on her own terms. And she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. Not without a fight. The next few weeks felt like a blur to Rebecca. She had been preparing for a long fight, but nothing had quite prepared her for the sheer weight of what was coming. As the legal battle began to unfold, it quickly became clear that Westridge Coastal Holdings wasn't just pushing for access. They were pushing to take control of the entire lakefront, and they would stop at nothing to do it. The initial resistance she had put up during the meeting with the county commissioners had bought her some time, but time was running out. Every day she spent waiting for a breakthrough was another day the development company had to solidify their position and gather more support. And behind the scenes, Rebecca knew they were doing everything they could to build momentum, securing deals with contractors, engaging public relations firms, and subtly yet unmistakably applying pressure on the local government officials who were supposed to be impartial. Matthew Delaney had been doing his best to manage the situation, but even he admitted that things weren't progressing as smoothly as they should. "We've got the legal angle, but Westridge's connections go deeper than we realized," he had said in one of their late-night conversations, his voice low and controlled, but tinged with frustration. "They've got a lot of influence in the area. It's not just about land ownership, it's about perception. They can paint you as the obstructionist, the one standing in the way of progress. And in this town, that could be enough to sway the board in their favor." Rebecca had never been a stranger to adversity. She'd dealt with her fair share of difficult clients and complicated projects in the past, but this situation was different. This wasn't just a problem she could fix with her usual tools and expertise. This was a fight for her home, her property, her entire existence in this community. And the deeper she dug, the more she realized just how tangled the situation had become. She couldn't ignore the fact that Westridge was using every legal and economic advantage at their disposal. They had the best lawyers, the deepest pockets, and the kind of political clout that could easily overrun her efforts. But Rebecca wasn't the kind of person who backed down from a challenge, especially not one that threatened everything she had worked so hard for. If anything, the closer she got to understanding their strategy, the more determined she became to stand her ground. She would fight them, but this time, she would fight smarter. The first breakthrough came when Rebecca decided to take matters into her own hands. She had spent days reviewing old land deeds, property records, and correspondence, looking for any hint of corruption or fraud, any detail that could give her the upper hand. It was late one evening when she found it. a small but glaring discrepancy buried in a file marked Land Consolidation. The document in question detailed an agreement between the county zoning board and a private firm that specialized in environmental assessments. It appeared to be a standard contract, but upon closer inspection, Rebecca saw that the agreement included a clause about retroactive property tax exemptions for landowners willing to sell or lease property along the lakefront. It wasn't the sort of thing that would raise alarms at first glance, but Rebecca had a feeling there was more to it. She wasn't sure yet what it meant, but it was something worth investigating. The next morning, she called Matthew, who agreed to meet her at the local courthouse to investigate the document further. They spent hours going through the files, cross-referencing land titles and tracing the chain of ownership. As they dug deeper, they discovered that the agreement wasn't just an isolated incident. In fact, several local property owners, including some who lived close to Rebecca's land, had signed similar agreements, all of which had been filed under the radar. The agreements were structured to look like routine zoning deals, but they included subtle language that would allow for the rezoning of land without full disclosure or community input. The more they looked, the more it became clear that Westridge Coastal wasn't just trying to take Rebecca's land. They were systematically securing land around the lake, bypassing legal safeguards and manipulating the system to acquire valuable waterfront property without facing public scrutiny. This new revelation gave Rebecca a renewed sense of purpose. Westridge's actions weren't just aggressive, they were illegal. And now, with this evidence in hand, she had the ammunition she needed to turn the tide. But as she reviewed the findings, a sinking feeling crept over her. If Westridge had been operating in such a covert manner with the zoning board, there was a strong possibility they had already secured most of the key land parcels around the lake. What's worse, it wasn't just the officials she needed to worry about. It was the other landowners who had already signed over their property. Many of them had done so quietly, without much opposition, eager to cash in on what they saw as an opportunity for quick profit. Rebecca had no illusions about them. They had been bought out, manipulated into giving up their land for pennies on the dollar. It wasn't just the bridge that had been destroyed. It was the entire community. The people who had lived around the lake for generations. The families who had kept their properties in the same hands for decades. All of them were being sold out piece by piece, and Rebecca knew that if she didn't act quickly, she could very well be the next one forced off her land. The threat was no longer just personal. It was communal, and she couldn't afford to let it happen. She decided to take the matter to the press. It was a risky move. She had no guarantee that the media would pick up the story or that they would be sympathetic to her cause. But it was a calculated risk. Rebecca wasn't about to let the developers win without at least making sure that everyone knew what was going on. She contacted a local journalist, Sarah Fields, who had covered environmental issues in the area for years. Sarah was skeptical at first, unsure of whether the story would hold water, but after reviewing the documents Rebecca had gathered, she agreed to write a piece on the illegal land grabs occurring around Blackridge Lake. The article was published 2 days later, and it quickly went viral. What followed was a storm of media coverage. Local news stations ran special segments on the story, and social media exploded with outrage. For the first time, the community was waking up to the threat that had been quietly hovering over them for months. People began to rally behind Rebecca, and the pressure on local officials mounted. But while the media attention helped to shine a spotlight on the issue, it also made Rebecca a target. Westridge Coastal wasn't going to let this go without a fight. Within hours of the article's publication, Rebecca's phone began to ring off the hook. Calls from anonymous sources, threats, veiled offers to buy her out. One voicemail even warned her that the situation would get ugly if she didn't drop the case. She knew then that the gloves were off and she was fully in their sights. Despite the threats, Rebecca refused to back down. She had already taken the first step by going public, and she wasn't going to let a few intimidating phone calls scare her off. She had too much to lose, and now she had too many people watching. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the future of Blackridge Lake and the people who had called it home for so long. She was their last line of defense, and she wasn't going to let them down. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, Rebecca felt like she was on the offensive. The ball was in her court, and she intended to keep it there. The fallout from the media coverage hadn't yet settled when the second escalation began. Not as a shock, but as a methodical tightening of screws. Rebecca had expected retaliation, of course. After all, she had exposed an organized and highly profitable strategy built on legal gray zones and bureaucratic loopholes. What she hadn't expected was how surgical it would feel. It didn't come as a grand offensive, no legal team barging into court, no formal countersuit. It began instead with silence, the kind that feels too perfect to be accidental. Phone calls that used to be returned within hours now went unanswered for days. County clerks who had previously been cordial and cooperative suddenly acted as if even basic requests for public records were invasive and suspect. Her access to building supply vendors in town, some of whom she had worked with for years, started to dry up. Orders were inexplicably delayed, back-ordered, or lost in the system. Rebecca had worked on enough large-scale infrastructure contracts to recognize coordinated pressure when she saw it. This wasn't coincidence. This was strategy, and it meant Westridge Coastal had called in favors. Quietly, off the books, but effectively. She stayed composed, but she also knew she couldn't fight invisible hands alone. Delaney had warned her this was the phase where most people caved, not because of fear, but because of erosion. Slow, steady, and demoralizing. "They won't burn your house down," he'd said dryly. "They'll just make sure you can't get plywood to fix your windows." And that's exactly what was happening. But Rebecca wasn't most people. She began cataloging everything. Shipments, calls, document requests, any correspondence that smelled of obstruction. She didn't try to act on it yet. She just gathered, quietly, meticulously, the same way she would in the early stages of a complex structural failure investigation. Collect, analyze, confirm. What rattled her wasn't the external pushback. It was what started happening at the property itself. It began with noises. Not every night, just enough to make her doubt her hearing. Twice she was woken up by what sounded like the roll of gravel, as if someone was walking across the space where her bridge had once stood. One night she stepped onto the porch and caught a beam of light cutting through the tree line on the far side of the lake. It disappeared before she could make out the source. Another evening she found muddy footprints near the side entrance of her basement. Fresh, wide, and too cleanly formed to be from a random hiker. They led to the utility access panel where her electrical system connected to the underground grid. Nothing was damaged, nothing stolen. Just opened and resealed. Like someone had inspected it, cataloged it, and moved on. Delaney, when told, didn't hesitate. They're casing you. It's intimidation, plain and simple. But don't take the bait. No confrontations, no weapons. You keep documenting, and we escalate only when it counts. Rebecca obeyed the advice, even if it left her teeth grinding in frustration. She wasn't naturally passive. Her instincts were to react, to intervene, to fortify. But she also understood escalation wasn't just about action. It was about timing, so she adjusted. She replaced every lock on the property with digital smart systems that operated independently of her main power supply. She brought in a technician to install ground-level vibration sensors on the side yard. She created redundancies in her water pump and heating systems. If they were going to probe for weaknesses, they were going to find only sealed doors and steel bones. That's when the attacks changed form again. On a Monday morning, just before sunrise, she woke to the sound of her fire alarm. Not a shrieking alarm, a slow, steady beep from the carbon monoxide monitor. It wasn't a malfunction. Her secondary sensor confirmed trace elements near the air intake system. The fire department responded within 30 minutes, checked her systems, and confirmed what she suspected. Someone had poured a thin stream of an unidentifiable compound near the intake vents, not enough to poison, but enough to trigger the alert. It wasn't an accident. It was a message. A subtle reminder that even her most basic safety wasn't guaranteed. The fire chief, a tall, weathered man with a mustache like steel wool, looked at her after the inspection and said nothing for a long time. Then he asked, "You planning to stick around, Miss Shelton?" She nodded. He gave a slow nod back and said, "Then you're going to need to be very careful." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even advice. It was acknowledgement. Something was happening out here, and he couldn't touch it. Rebecca doubled down. She moved her work setup from the main house into the smaller detached garage at the back of the property, converting it into a hardened office space with emergency backup power, its own filtered ventilation, and encrypted off-grid communication. Equipment, the holdover from a previous project overseas. She wasn't hiding, she was preparing, but she knew she had to move quickly. Delaney had discovered that the Zoning Commission had quietly scheduled a rehearing to revisit Westridge's proposal, one with a modified scope that now listed Rebecca's land as Designated Utility Corridor. They had rebranded the project. Now it wasn't just a luxury development. It was an eco-rehabilitation zone with recreational access. A clever trick wrapping a hostile land acquisition in conservation language. Public good, environmental stewardship, low-impact recreation, all buzzwords, all lies. And the hearing was set for just 10 days away. In the interim, Rebecca received a letter by courier. Not an email, not a phone call. A physical envelope, hand-delivered, no return address. Inside, a single-page document offering to buy her property at a premium to avoid further complications. The language was clinical, cold, but the message was unmistakable. Get out, take the money, and disappear. She didn't respond. She didn't tear it up. She added it to the growing stack of evidence she kept in a fireproof safe behind the tool rack in her office. That night, the sensors lit up at 2:42 a.m. Rebecca reviewed the footage remotely. 3 figures, no masks, no rush. Just slow, deliberate motion along the ridge above the old bridge site. They didn't cross the property line. They didn't touch anything. But they stood there for nearly 4 minutes, watching, observing. Then they turned, one by one, and walked back into the trees. The message was clear. We're here. We see you. And we're not going anywhere. She sent the footage to Delaney in the morning. He didn't reply with words. Just an attachment. A draft injunction against Westridge Coastal, and an emergency motion to halt the zoning hearing on the basis of intimidation and unlawful private interference. The case would be hard to prove, but it would stall them. Maybe long enough to expose more. Rebecca knew they'd retaliate. And they did, in the most audacious way yet. On the 8th day, 2 men in work uniforms showed up at her gate with an unmarked truck and claimed they were there to inspect the erosion barriers. Rebecca, watching from her office, buzzed them through and stepped outside to confront them. She didn't accuse them. She didn't yell. She simply asked for identification. They offered none. One of them shrugged and said they had verbal orders from the county. She nodded and said, "Then the county won't mind a call to confirm." She walked back inside and shut the door. Within 10 minutes, they were gone. She never called the county. There was no point. She already knew the answer. They were probing again, looking for weakness, finding none. Rebecca stood at the edge of the clearing that night, staring at the dark space where her bridge had once connected her to the rest of the world. The second escalation had come and gone, but she knew the next phase wouldn't be subtle. They had tried pressure. They had tried fear. Now they'd try destruction. She had to be ready, and she was. The morning of the hearing arrived with a strange, almost deliberate stillness. Rebecca stood in front of the mirror, tying her hair back into a low knot. Not out of vanity, but control. The same way she used to lace her boots before stepping onto unstable scaffolding. The same way she once braced herself before standing in front of a skeptical panel of engineers decades her senior. This wasn't a courtroom drama. There wouldn't be shouting or slammed fists or dramatic cross-examinations. It would be a procedure stacked with monotony, cloaked in legal terminology and bureaucratic tone. But make no mistake, it was war. The Zoning Commission, now under public scrutiny after the media coverage and anonymous tips that had followed, couldn't dismiss her claims outright. But they didn't need to. All they had to do was let the developers talk longer, present cleaner diagrams, bring in glossy photos of green redevelopment, and smiling stock families walking through boardwalks on a fake shoreline. Rebecca had seen it before. Words like revitalization and eco-friendly used to sedate resistance. She arrived early with Delaney and the surveyor, Charles Hanks, by her side. No one greeted them. Inside the hall, the air was already thick with quiet tension. Westridge Coastal Holdings had come prepared, but not ostentatiously so. No camera crews, no security detail. Just 4 people in expensive neutral suits, seated behind a thin barrier of printed posters and talking point handouts. The man leading their presentation was Alan Jacobs again, backed by 2 engineers whose credentials were difficult to dispute. One had even worked at the same consulting firm as Rebecca over a decade ago. That familiarity didn't comfort her. It only made the game more insidious. When Jacobs began his presentation, it wasn't with aggression. It was with apparent humility. He praised the charm and character of the area, acknowledged the valid concerns raised by some property owners, and then, with a straight face, referred to Rebecca's bridge as a hazard removed for the sake of long-term stability. Her name wasn't spoken aloud, but her work, her property, her voice, all of it had been neutralized into a passive line item, something to be noted, not confronted. Jacob's slideshow was well-timed, featuring overlays of projected walkways, kayaks coasting along clear waters, trees digitally inserted over the very places they'd already cleared in secret. It was fantasy made palatable by architecture. Delaney kept calm. He'd warned her not to rise to the bait, and she didn't. But when it was their turn to speak, Rebecca did not sit back and let the lawyer handle it. She stood, not with passion but with precision. She placed one sheet of paper in front of the commission, a notarized technical report authored by her and Hanks, detailing the unauthorized dismantling of her bridge, the manipulation of utility easement filings, and the unregistered soil work, carried out on her side of the property line. Then she handed them a printed copy of the fire department's incident report from the carbon monoxide event. Finally, she presented a sealed envelope. A USB drive containing security footage of the nighttime surveillance, the motion sensor logs, the utility box tampering, and the men in uniforms who showed up without orders. She didn't look at the Westridge team as she laid the pieces down. She didn't have to. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about foundation. Every piece of data was checked, verified, admissible. And it shifted something. Not in the crowd. There was no crowd, but in the commission itself. The room didn't erupt. It sank. The previously dismissive expression on Commissioner Fraser's face tightened. One of the junior aides took out a notebook and started writing with sudden speed. Jacobs didn't interrupt. His fingers tensed slightly, gripping the edge of his notes. He didn't argue. He waited, but the weight had shifted. For the first time, they weren't driving the meeting. They were managing it. Still, Rebecca knew the hearing wouldn't end with a decision. The commission announced a delay, citing the emergence of new documentation and the need to consult external counsel. No victory, no ruling, but a stall. And in this kind of war, a stall was oxygen. When she returned home that afternoon, Rebecca didn't expect silence. She expected reaction, and she was right. The first sign was the absence of birds. Then came the scent. Faint, acidic, unnatural. She scanned the house perimeter, eyes moving in precise arcs, and found it within minutes. A leak in the fuel line of her generator, a slow, purposeful incision along the hose beneath the cover, not cut with a knife but bored, small enough to drip undetected. A fire risk, a death risk. The cameras hadn't caught it. The perpetrator had moved from a blind spot, crawled under. This wasn't random. It was calculated. It was punishment. She didn't panic. She shut off the system manually, removed the hose, bagged it with gloves, and placed it in the evidence safe next to the couriered threat letter. She called Delaney. He didn't tell her what to do. He just said, "Now we're ready." The injunction was filed that night. With the hearing formally delayed and the footage delivered to multiple state departments, Westridge had lost their window. Rebecca knew they wouldn't vanish, but they'd been forced into retreat, exposed enough that new acquisitions would take place under heavier scrutiny. The local fire marshal, after receiving the fuel line report, issued an independent statement requesting investigation into property sabotage. That gave Rebecca something rare in situations like this. A lever. By the time the week closed, Westridge issued a vague press release announcing their temporary withdrawal from site activities around Black Ridge Lake, pending regulatory review. No mention of Rebecca. No mention of the sabotage. But they were pulling back. Their quiet construction hub in the forest was dismantled by noon. The crates disappeared, the flags were gone, and Rebecca, tired, bruised, but standing, crossed the clearing in front of her property alone for the first time in over a month. She didn't rebuild the bridge right away, not yet, but she knew she would. And when she did, it wouldn't be for access or utility. It would be for memory and for proof. It took 3 weeks for Rebecca to feel like she could breathe again. And even then, the air seemed thin, fragile, like something held together by delicate threads she had yet to test. The legal and bureaucratic machinery that had once seemed insurmountable had begun to grind to a halt. And for the first time in over a month, the oppressive weight of uncertainty lifted from her shoulders, even if only slightly. Westridge Coastal had retreated, not with the fanfare of defeat, but with the quiet resignation of a company that had underestimated the resolve of a single person who refused to bow. Rebecca wasn't naive enough to believe it was over. Their press release had been a formality, a feeble attempt to placate the mounting scrutiny. But behind that carefully crafted statement lay a quiet truth. They had been exposed. Their power was no longer absolute. What mattered now wasn't just the immediate victory of halting their plans. What mattered was what Rebecca had done in that moment. She had seized control of the narrative. She had made it clear that her land, her home, and her bridge were not just symbols of personal loss and perseverance, but pieces of a much larger story. A story that, despite all their power and influence, Westridge Coastal couldn't rewrite. What followed wasn't a loud confrontation or an immediate change in the law, but something quieter, more insidious. A sense of momentum. People started to take notice, and not just those in the local community who had already rallied behind her. There were whispers in the county, murmurs in local media outlets, and soon, even some political figures began to question the methods that had been used to bulldoze through the region's development plans. It didn't happen overnight, but the attention slowly turned with one small, crucial moment after another. Rebecca's fight wasn't just hers anymore. It was something larger, something that, even if unintentionally, had awakened a sleeping giant of public awareness. The legal proceedings continued, slow and methodical, as Delaney worked tirelessly to ensure that Westridge's withdrawal wasn't just a temporary pause but a long-term impediment. The injunction had bought time, but it had also provided an opportunity. An opportunity for others to question, to investigate, and to demand answers that Westridge couldn't easily ignore. Rebecca didn't have the luxury of waiting for a perfect resolution. She still had a life to rebuild, and so did the place she had fought so fiercely to protect. Every morning she walked along the edge of the lake, surveying the remains of what had once been her bridge. It was a solemn ritual, one that reminded her of both the fragility and strength that had defined her through this whole process. The old bridge was gone, but what remained was hers. Her land, her vision, her right to stand on this ground and make her mark. She had been tested in ways she never expected. The sabotage, the intimidation, the isolation, and the legal battles had all tried to break her, but they hadn't. And now, as she stood at the edge of the lake, she knew what she had to do. The bridge had always been more than just a structure. It had been a declaration, a physical manifestation of her determination and her desire to take control of her own life again. It had connected her to her past, to her sister, to the land. It had been a symbol of both survival and possibility. And now, as the tension from the battle began to ebb, Rebecca knew it was time to rebuild. She wasn't just rebuilding a bridge, she was rebuilding herself. The second bridge would be stronger, more resilient. This time, it wouldn't be just for her, though. It would stand as a reminder to everyone who passed under it that there were people who would fight for what they believed in, and that those people could never be underestimated. Weeks later, the formal court hearing came to an end, and the ruling was delivered with a quiet finality. The zoning request from Westridge Coastal was denied, the land designation was corrected, and the planned development around Blackridge Lake was indefinitely suspended. Rebecca's legal team had successfully uncovered the full extent of the fraudulent filings and the shady practices Westridge had attempted to employ, and with that, they were forced to back down. It wasn't a victory based on some miraculous legal loophole or an appeal to a higher court. It was a victory rooted in perseverance and patience. Rebecca's ability to stay grounded, to keep her head through all the chaos, had allowed her to turn the tide. As the news of the decision spread, Rebecca received letters of gratitude from some of the other local property owners, who had also been under the threat of forced buyouts. Some had signed agreements out of fear or ignorance, while others had been hesitant, unsure of how to fight back. But now they were emboldened. Rebecca's victory had become their own, and for the first time in years, the residents of Blackridge Lake felt like they had a voice. The months that followed were spent rebuilding. Rebecca, alongside a trusted crew of local contractors, began the long, arduous process of designing and constructing the new bridge. This one would be built to last, incorporating the lessons she had learned through her struggles. It would be a bridge not just of concrete and steel, but of defiance. It would stand as a reminder of how far she had come, of how much had been lost and how much had been reclaimed. Every day as she worked with the crew, she felt a sense of purpose and peace that she hadn't known in years. The steady rhythm of construction, the feel of tools in her hands, the quiet hum of machinery working alongside her, it all felt like a return to something familiar, something that had always been hers. The bridge was completed by the fall. It stood tall and strong, gleaming under the setting sun as Rebecca stood at the edge, watching the final touches be put into place. It wasn't just a bridge anymore, it was a symbol of resistance, a symbol of survival, and most importantly, a symbol of victory. The same bridge that had been torn down, piece by piece, now stood taller than ever. It connected her land to the wider world, but it also stood as a physical reminder that no one could take away her claim to what was rightfully hers. The fight was over, but Rebecca knew in some quiet part of her soul that it was never truly about the land or the bridge. It had always been about reclaiming her sense of agency, her ability to make decisions and stand firm in the face of those who thought they could take it all away. And with that, she could finally rest.